Thank you for your patience with these technical glitches, but we are coming up. Well, welcome. Hello. This is the Sisters Bonded in Action webinar series. I'm Ayana Young, and thank you for joining us tonight. I look forward to all of you engaging at the end of this interview with your questions. So please think about that while we're in this interview, and then at the end I'll actually be able to bring you on the video and you can ask questions to the guests directly. Tonight's topic is on dismantling systemic white supremacy. And in order to cultivate the paradigm shift our culture deeply yearns for, and we must learn about the prevailing paradigm, how it came to be, how the hierarchical divisions it relies on are systematically maintained, and how it shapes each and every one of us. Capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism. This is the Sisters Bonded in Action webinar series. Hold on, there's just another little technical glitch, but so this colonialism, the imperialism, the foundational subjugation of bodies that these invisible policies and systems depend on, and the white supremacy inherent in their perpetration. We must look at the current socioeconomic reality head on and truly ask ourselves how it has been embedded in our minds, our hearts, and our bodies, from tangible aspects such as social mobility and access to clean air, water, and food, to the way we perceive each other as humans, as well as our plant and animal kin. Breaking free of the shackles of this dominant culture has placed upon us is not easy work. We're all called down to lay down our pride, to show up with humility, integrity, and the willingness to acknowledge our own biases, conditioning, and learn every step of the way. So tonight, I'm really excited to discuss these topics with Natasha Marin, Rain Crow, and Molly Crittenden. Natasha is a conceptual artist and digital engagement specialist. Her work connects her with creative thinkers and doers all over the planet. IRL, far from the relative safety afforded to her by her avatar, her intersections include being assigned female at birth and being non-white identified. She appreciates people who demonstrate a lifelong love of learning by asking thoughtful questions. Her recent project, Reparations, at www.reparations.me/press, is a social experiment exploring alternative economies, community care, and intersectional privilege. She is the author of Milk, creator of #Women-Centered, Red Lineage, and Midnight Tea, and can be reached online at natasha/marin.com. Molly Crittenden has worked for the past 18 years as a K-12 educator. After majoring in ethnic studies, getting her teaching credentials, and master's degree in education, she's been a bilingual elementary school teacher, high school teacher, and now is in her 11th year directing a community engagement program in a high school in San Francisco. She infuses her own learning about whiteness, compassion, and social justice into the teaching she does about social issues and cultural competency, and in her role as a mother of 2 young biracial boys. Rain Crow teaches from a body of work dedicated to cultivating the arts of interdependent relationships through group facilitation, meditation, education, and priestessing. She is a regenerative culture events organizer who engages with spiritual, political, rewilding, and intentional communities all over the country. She teaches and writes about magic and ritual, the ancestral skills of council making, conflict transformation, systems thinking in radical organizing, and ecstatic connection to the sacred. She is a 45-year-old queer witch and lives on unceded ancestral Multnomah and Talkeetna lands. She is actively involved in unsettling herself and her worlds while calling into being the Refugium Village Mystery School and dream temple, her life's work and most fervent vision. Wow. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being on tonight. And I'd like to just start by diving into this big topic of white supremacy. And I think that for much of the American public, the term white supremacy takes minds towards extremist groups such as the Aryan Brotherhood or the Ku Klux Klan, disregarding that it's at the core of today's globalized societal state. For that reason, I'd love to start this off by illuminating the origins of white supremacy, as well as its relationship to capitalism and patriarchy. So I'm wondering if you all could take us through the narrative of how white supremacy was born, how it took hold and spread around the world, and how it's come to accumulate so much power in the hands of so few. Yes, Natasha, please.
I just said, I wrote down supremacy is a delusion, but I can't write backwards. Yeah, I think a lot of people of color probably sit around asking themselves this question, like, how did this get started? Like, what was it? I asked myself that question too about sort of patriarchal domination. Like, how do you think that started? I think that, humans are connected in the fact that we don't really come up with new emotions, or motivations. Most of us are motivated by the same sorts of things. So I'm thinking that maybe it was something along the lines of insecurity that kind of started this off. Because when you're thinking about it, we talk about capitalism, we talk about economics, but at least in the United States, the capital that capitalism is based on was Black bodies. That was the first capital. So in a really weird way, it's interesting to think about how Black bodies have always had value, despite the history of them being devalued. Because one thing we know for sure is that there was like a market value attached to the Black body. That could be a compliment in some ways, but it's really difficult to extract that when you're discussing white supremacy. But I think that perhaps just the reality that the wealthiest countries with the most resources happen to be where a lot of people of color are located, and that sort of the capital that's floating around in the world right now that the economy is based on really comes from like one group of people under the delusion of supremacy, taking the resources that the other groups had and have still. Whether this is land, water, trade routes, technology, culture, dance, language, you name it, all the wealth that exists already existed. It was just redirected would be the most fair word that I could use, like deliberately, purposefully, overly fair. But I'm interested to hear what other people think. Like when you sit down to ask yourself this question, how do you satisfy the question yourself? Like how do you answer it for yourself? I think it's insecurity. I think it's like an actual lack, like a measurable lack led to the folks with, hardly any melanin that the sun wasn't even trying to love on, fleeing their caves where they were busily humping their goats, to take on new vistas by like trolling around the world, taking stuff and declaring themselves the best. I mean, I think about it in terms of like dynamics in a family. That's kind of the way maybe like a toddler would act. This is mine. I'm taking it. I don't know. I'm remuting myself.
Well, thank you for that visual. That gave me a bit of a chuckle. And Rain, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Natasha. Well, I think it's a rich question. And I teach a course called The Burning Times Never Ended, which is based on the book Caliban and the Witch. And one of the things that this author, Silvia Federici, talks about, which I think you were getting at, Natasha, for sure, is about the sort of convergence of the witch hunts that were happening in Europe, the origins of the mid-Atlantic slave trade of enslaved peoples, and the first contact, beginning the sort of wave of conquest in the Americas, sort of all were more or less kind of happening in the same time period. And that, you asked also about capitalism. And so one of the things that I've been learning about is, through this course that I'm doing, more about what we can see is that coming out of the period of sort of feudalism, right, through this big epic of feudalism happening in Europe, and we can also kind of think of that as a form of colonization in and itself for some people who were living there. And all these things had to happen in order for capitalism to take root. There had to be all these legislative, judicial, political, social changes that happened against primarily feminized people in lots of different places in Europe, in order to kind of, and that happened through this system of terror, essentially. What I see happening through the material is then that gets exported, and this idea of who qualifies as a subject, who qualifies as a real human being, who then is granted agency and sovereignty and rights. And as this is getting exported, I'm kind of like brushing over several hundred years of history to kind of get to where I'm going. What gets exported with this is an idea of racial superiority, or in fact, racial construction in and of itself. One of my favorite books is An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And she talks about how even in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain in like the 1500s, 1600s, this idea of who has pure blood is starting to happen. And there it was really about wealthy landed people, landowners, wanting to prevent Jews and Muslims from being able to convert to Christianity, because the legal structure there said you had more rights if you were Christian, and this is under the Roman Catholic Church. And there, this gets exported, and we can see it happening through Protestantism with the English colonizing Ireland and proclaiming that the Irish don't qualify as like a racial identity of people that deserves certain rights. And then, this comes over to the Americas in different ways. And my understanding, or the lens that I look at it through, is also through the enforcement of the racial identity piece, making whiteness superior and changing the goalpost always on what whiteness means, was also a way of breaking the growing solidarity amongst enslaved people who were being captured and brought to the continent, the control and conquest of indigenous people on this continent, and the poorest of the white European people that were brought over, who were effectively mobilizing and trying to dissemble the sort of wealthy elites' control over the dispensation of rights and privileges in this world. So maybe I'll just stop there for a second, see if anyone else wants to say anything. But totally, it's constructed. It's a made-up thing, and it's a strategy, and it's a pathological strategy that is continuing to kill people. So, not working.
I'd like to add to that too. And first of all, just say thank you so much to both Natasha and Rain for what you've already given in terms of just your perspective and understanding. So thank you for that. And I want to just build a little bit on what Rain was saying in terms of there being a very clear strategical way in which whiteness in particular has been utilized by the white elite beginning, well, before, but really distinctly during slavery, when white Irish indentured servants and African American enslaved folks were beginning to come together along class lines, really, to rebel against the slave owners and the owners of indentured servants way back in those days. And the response of the ruling white elite at that point was a divide and conquer tactic, where they began to give more privilege to the white indentured servants in order to divide and conquer, to separate that that solidarity that was beginning with the rebellions against the slave owners. And so this tactic of white ruling elite using race to divide and conquer people of different races who are struggling in the class division has been used over and over again in history in order to maintain the status quo of a ruling white elite, and ensuring that white poor people and people of color are not unifying and giving these kind of like crumbs from the table of some elevated rights and inviting them into perceived unity with the white elite, so that they do not feel the solidarity with people of color and continue to unify in order to rise up against the ruling class. And so whiteness, the creation of whiteness has really been strategically used throughout history over and over again in this same manner.
Well, thanks to all of you for those descriptions and just diving into what the concept of whiteness is. And because white supremacy is fundamental to American society, to be born into an identity defined as white is to be born with disproportionate privileges. And inherent in one's group's privileges is the oppression of another. So I'm wondering if we could delve into white folks in America and how the system is actually designed to maintain such a chasm.
I can begin with a little bit around that. So when we think about major systems that impact our lives in significant ways, we think about systems of power within the government. We think about educational systems, criminal justice systems. So major structures that have significant impact on all of our lives and our chances for success, our ability to thrive and reach our potential or not in life. And when we think about every one of those major systems, it is very, very evident who is in power in all of those systems. And also, if we look at statistics around who has access to resources, there are always exceptions, but by and large, in those systems and who is being disproportionately kept down by those systems, race and class, but race primarily is the biggest indicator of inequity in terms of who has access to success and resources in our society. And so in looking at all of the major systems that impact our lives and our livelihoods, we see race and inequity around race in